things we can do with this data are incredible. And we can tell you when you're going to die with a 92% accuracy within a 5-year time period. But not just death, we can predict when diseases are coming just from a drop of blood.
Meet Ryan Smith, founder of TruDiagnostics and a leader in epigenetic testing. His work deciphers how lifestyle and environment influence our DNA,
offering new pathways to extend health span. Stay tuned for a compelling conversation on aging and wellness.
So hold on one second. You say that you could predict 5 years in advance before someone's going to die.
We're not making claims. We can predict it highly accurately. What people don't realize is age is the biggest risk factor for every chronic disease and death. If everyone decreased their biological age by 7 years, we could cut the incidence of disease in half. 50% of people would no longer be sick.
I want to understand what epigenetics are.
Every cell in your body has the same DNA. Epigenetics, though, is the reason that all those cells behave differently.
What causes gene expression change?
Your body has extremely complicated mechanisms to regulate this. And I tell people, if you have problems with regulating this DNA expression, you just don't survive.
Dude, how many books do you read a day? Like, where do you get this information? Because this is not just information that's like readily available. What's the next big thing for Ryan Smith over here? Welcome to another episode of a Healthy Point of View podcast. I'm your host, Sam Tejada. And like always, we're bringing experts from all over the world in the health, wellness, and beauty sector. So today we have someone who's been in the field for a very long time. This is one of the initial peptide gurus who really brought peptides here to the United States with his team and tons of research. This is a biochemist. He's a peptide expert, but most recently an expert in epigenetics, and then also all of the treatment modalities that come along with it. Today we have Ryan Smith here at the podcast. Ryan, pleasure, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been a viewer of these for a little bit now, so happy to be on.
Yeah, man. Yeah. So, and you've been in the industry for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen it. You've seen this industry go from where it was basically nothing to all of a sudden, you got this whole thing where we got conferences every other week, or maybe every week at this point, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Yeah. It's hard to believe it's been over a decade now, which is crazy since my first introduction at things like A4M and a few other conferences. But it's wild how long it's been, and honestly, how much has changed as well.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how you even got involved in this thing, because, you're formerly educated in biochemistry, right? You went to medical school.
Yeah.
And you said, you know what, I'm going to go a little bit of a different path. So I want to know why you decided to go the path that you're in and how we even got where we're at today.
Yeah, definitely. So I passed my step 1 in medical school. So for people who don't know, the first 2 years of medical school are most of your training, right? Your sort of academic training. And I loved it. But really quickly got to my 3rd year and the clinical portion and sort of treating patients and really feeling a little bit disheartened. I think that, anybody who's been in this functional medicine industry before probably has a similar story, right? Where they get a little disillusioned with the patient care they're doing, feel like they're not making a difference. Mine just happened really quick. And I just really felt like I was, following a formula and really not helping people. And it wasn't super exciting to me. So I made the very stupid financial decision at the time to quit. And then really started to create Tailor Made Compounding, which was a compounding pharmacy with sort of the focus of really doing innovative pharmaceuticals. So we started a lot of the peptides, as you mentioned. Most of the peptides people are using today, thymosin beta, thymosin alpha, the BPC, all the growth hormone secretagogues. We were really the first pharmacy to adopt, educate, and really scale that in a major way.
Right. I mean, you guys were it back then. and I was telling you backstage, it's like, till today, I think I still have that peptide catalog, which everybody considered it like the peptide Bible.
Yeah.
And you guys were really big into making sure you're educating people on all these peptides.
Yeah.
But man, back then, you guys had every peptide you can think of, right?
Yeah.
So, and you guys were doing a lot of research with the peptides back then, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The that was actually what got me to where I am even today is that it was really a biohacker's dream, right, at that point, because we were scouring the literature for anything that looked really promising, had really good phase 2 safety data, maybe was in phase 3, but not yet FDA approved. A lot of the things we were even doing then weren't FDA approved, which are FDA approved now. So even just in the past few years have gotten FDA approval. So we were really avant-garde at testing out all these new molecules, but we also knew that at the end of the day, we needed a lot of research to make sure they were sustainable and you could do them for a long time in this industry. And so we started to do a lot of that research. And it's actually what brought me eventually to some of the diagnostics we're doing with TruDiagnostics now, sort of being able to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. So, back then when you were doing a lot of these,
Mhm,
the research on
mhm.
peptides, was that research here in the US, or I
Yeah.
think you guys had some research in like Austria or Australia or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So Australia actually had a big market in some of these peptides even before the US adopted it. And even
Wow.
before that, Russia in particular has always been a leader for some of the peptides, particularly the bioregulators and things of that nature. The only thing that we did was to try and do interventional studies in a couple of different patients. One of my favorite examples is, things like epitalin. This is one of those bioregulator peptides. It was sort of done in Russia with Dr. Kavinson initially. But everyone was using it to increase telomerase and to increase telomere length. Some of the studies showed 33% increases in telomere length, which is obviously a staple of any aging conversation that we have.
Right.
And so we did some trials to see if it increased telomere length, and unfortunately we found it didn't. But it's still a great product and one that has a lot of other benefits. But that was an example of some of the studies that we were doing, and now applying it really in practice and to see what types of benefits we could get.
Amazing. Yeah, man. I remember back then I was always like researching things because I was into like
Yeah.
bodybuilding as well too. And I remember reaching out to you, and you guys didn't have the compound available just yet. And let me see if I remember. It was a GW
Yeah, yeah.
something. And I reached out to you and I was like, dude, is there any way that we can get this? He was like, yeah, I can make it happen. And literally within like a few days, I had it, already sourced. And I was just like,
Definitely.
damn, this guy Ryan, he's just like, make shit happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And exciting class of molecules, the GW1516, PPA or delta agonists for improvements in performance. And they're
Right.
great products. But again, one that was sort of bought by a big pharmaceutical company and then just sort of abandoned.
Wow.
But still great therapeutic activity and one that we had some good success with.
So let's talk about when you were in the peptide
Mhm.
world and you made that transition. There's a few things that ended up happening, right? And we see this frequently with a
Yeah.
lot of these governing agencies with the three-letter
Yeah. Yeah.
words, right?
Definitely.
Um, what happened?
Yeah.
Like they were you guys were going from like you started from nothing
Yeah.
to all of a sudden making revenues of like 80 million a year. You guys are
Yeah.
killing it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, like everyone's like I remember,
Yeah.
like, all of my competition is reaching, "Where are we gonna get our peptides?
Yeah.
Where are we getting our peptides? Like, what do we do now?" You know? So I
Yeah.
wanna talk about that because we're noticing a lot of these type of things happening now with some of
Yeah.
the GLP-1 drugs. Like, gosh, man, I hate to say it on the podcast, but I got sued by Novo Nordics,
Yeah.
right? And finally, you know, getting finally knock on wood, I'm getting to a settlement with them.
Yeah.
But, I get heat from
Mhm.
all different directions myself as through Liquivita. So
Yeah.
I know exactly how it feels, where you
Yeah.
were coming from. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, it was a crazy time. We talked about all the good stuff about it, right? The meteoric success we had. I mean, we went from me as the first employee to over 250 employees. I think within 2.5 years, doing really great in revenue. I think I actually felt like we were helping people as well. A lot of really happy patients, a lot of really happy physicians. But we had an equally sort of meteoric fall as well. And so I remember taking my first ever vacation after working with Tailor Made. It was probably 3.5 years in. And I wake up to text messages basically saying, hey, the FBI is here and has gotten the building.
How did that feel when you heard like the
Ooh.
FBI is here? Like
Oh
I've
my
never. The
God.
only time I've actually dealt with the FBI is like when I was at the fire department,
Yeah.
and they were like investigating somebody that we transported or something, and even that it's just like dude, the FBI.
Yeah.
It's like it's not local police, it's not like the county police, it's the FBI.
Yeah,
You
it
know?
was extremely, extremely nerve-wracking. I mean, I think I just went into panic mode. It's hard to even remember. I think I was in Colorado trying to ski, and my trip was canceled that day. I was on a flight back, but it was crazy. I mean, we didn't. I mean, we had no idea that this was coming. Just complete surprise, and really didn't know why either. I think that we felt like we were doing things well and on the up and up, and unfortunately, it was sort of just this idea that the FDA and the Justice Department as well were super interested in the loophole that we were sort of using, which was that by definition, compounding drugs are not FDA approved. And this is because, if you need a pediatric dose, you're going to have to do it in a different dose that's not commercially available. Or if someone
Right.
has an allergy, for instance, you're going to have to do a formulation that doesn't include products that they might have an allergy to. So the compounding has sort of been built in this to fit this gray zone. And so we were sort of using it as well to do really innovative things. And that certainly was not, I think, what the FDA wanted. And so Unfortunately, though, there's no laws against it, and so that was one of the biggest conundrums. Is that there was certainly FDA guidance, but the guidance is not law. And eventually, I think that they really were just trying to stop us from doing any of the peptide things. And so essentially, all the revenue we were doing, we probably went to 15% of that overnight, just
Wow.
instantaneously, lost the majority of it. But the most frustrating part is that we were sort of the only one this happened to. Pharmacies all over the U.S. were still and are still doing peptides in a major way, and so it felt, we were a little bit bitter, in the years
Of
coming, just to
course.
see everyone still being successful with the markets that we had sort of built. But at the same time, you're also super happy that those things are still available, because you've seen how much they've helped additional people. But it was a crazy time, and eventually, we didn't nothing really happened with the pharmacy outside of being not able to do the medications anymore. Unfortunately, my partner in the pharmacy got a felony charge for shipping B12 to California without a specific prescription, which is unfortunate as well. But overall, it was really just the end of peptides.
Well, listen,
Yeah.
anybody who understands about the different states,
Yeah.
California is the one that's just like, man, they're looking to hit people over the head for something. California is
Absolutely.
just difficult in all facets.
Mhm.
Difficult with franchising, extra taxes on everything, even on your grocery bags. When it comes to all the medical stuff, like,
Yeah.
listen, that's one of the accounts or sorry, one of the states that we have to
Mhm.
sell our IV pack
Yeah.
kits and
Yeah.
packets, and it's difficult.
Yeah.
Like they're always up our ass, California. So I get it,
Yeah.
So, but it's good that people can understand that.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to like, the FBI, what do
Yeah.
you think snitched?
I have no idea. Even with all the records, I'm sure it might have been a competitor, or you even see it now happening where pharmacies are, getting a little bit contentious with each other because
Yeah,
someone has chose to sort of follow some of the new guidance and others are not, and some people think that's an unfair competitive advantage, and so you see it even now. So it could have been a number of individuals, but the good news, I think, is one of the big takeaways is that we're starting to see a little bit more freedom in that area.
right,
I think that the FDA still has this category list of what you can and cannot compound,
right.
but if it's not on the list, generally there's no rule against it. And now with some of the Supreme Court decisions, limiting some of the federal power, it looks like that a lot of states get to make those decisions now, and makes them much more widely available for consumers. So I think that certainly, unfortunately, we were one of the biggest and one of the first people to draw attention, but I think that it's now certainly a more sustainable route, and peptides are, I think, officially coming back, which is good to hear.
Yeah, I think so too.
Mhm.
But listen, snitches get stitches, so we'll figure out who it did.
Yeah.
And listen, one of the things that recently
Mhm.
we saw something that happened in the 503B space,
Mhm.
right? One of the pharmacies based out of Texas, there was a guy that
Mhm.
created a Delaware company and was reporting all of these other pharmacies out there. So what is your input when it comes,
Yeah,
because I'm a huge proponent of let's win together.
absolutely.
And for
Yeah.
me, when we're out here preaching, like, hey, let's change the course of medicine, and we're all preaching that, the last thing we need to do is divide
Yeah.
ourselves and then allow Big Pharma or one of these other, government
Yeah.
things win over us. So, what is your stance when it comes to, this type of behavior?
Yeah, I think I'm exactly on your same boat. I think it's a little crazy to try and single out other people in the industry. One of my favorite things about the integrated medicine industry in this cash-based space is it's a really big space, but it's still small within medicine.
It is.
And I think that most of the practices that exist here are single LLCs, right? They're physicians who hang their own sort of plaque and get a brick and mortar location and try and scale their business. But we're doing some of the most amazing medicine in this space, and I can see it now. I can see the data on these diagnostics, and I think that the more cohesiveness that we have, the more we can sort of just tell, more than anecdotes, right? I think we all have these stories about how well a patient did on a therapy, and I think that those are all incredibly powerful for us and the people we serve. But I also think that in order to make it more impactful, we need to do it in a way that speaks to the regulatory agencies, speaks to the
Absolutely.
university researchers. And so one of the things we've really tried to do at TruDiagnostic is to really start building that data set with our integrative providers to then do study collaborations with the Harvards, the Yales of the world, the Stanfords of the world, and really show people how good the medicine actually is in this space.
So let's talk about that, man. True Diagnostics. What
Yeah.
is True Diagnostics?
Yeah, so when I was in this peptide space, as I mentioned, we were always knew that the FDA might come knocking. And so we were always looking for ways to show that these products worked because we were seeing it, right? And one of the things that caught my eye during this time was these epigenetic clocks. And so these are sort of molecular diagnostics, which look at your gene expression markers to tell you how you're aging. And it might sound at first like really esoteric or vanity driven, but what people don't realize is age is the biggest risk factor for every chronic disease and death.
Mm.
And so if we can treat or postpone aging, we can have massive population level health impacts. So just to give you an idea, if everyone increased or decreased their biological age by 7 years, we could cut the incidence of disease in half. 50% of people would no longer be sick. And so I was really excited about testing a lot of the peptides with this new sort of clock measurement. And so I was just really waiting until there was interventional trials. And so in really the fall to winter of 2019, the first ever interventional trial on these clocks happened. And it was doing growth hormone, DHEA, and metformin, sort of a combination. It was only 9 people. It was an extremely, extremely small cohort, but they showed anti-aging effects with just those 3 medications. Those 3 medications, which our community does quite a bit of, so that got me super excited. I just flew to LA and knocked on the study author's door the next day,
Oh, wow.
and that was really the start of True Diagnostic, where I saw the opportunity. First, to hit a need within the clinical medicine space. All the physicians who are already treating aging just need a really good way to quantify it.
Right.
But in addition to that, I saw the other potential of epigenetics. Most people are familiar with companies like 23andMe and see the things that they've done. But epigenetics is a little bit more powerful because it's changeable, right? You can take a genetic test once across your lifetime. It never changes. It's the same in every single cell. It's sort of who you are. But with these epigenetics, you can change them. Everything you do, your diet, your lifestyle, even the amount of close social relationships you have, all impact the epigenetics and also impact your aging.
So we're gonna get more into that.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, as a biochemist,
Yeah.
what is aging?
Oh, I think we're going to need more than the time in the podcast to tackle that. And that's actually one of the most frustrating parts is that people don't have a unified definition. Even researchers who've been working here for decades, so it's a hard definition to say. But really, I think most people would classify it as the progressive decline of our bodily functions over time.
Okay.
And how that happens or why that happens is greatly contested, but it's starting to gain a lot of momentum with true science. It's not just Ponce de Leon looking for the fountain of youth anymore. It is a scientific endeavor, and we're still trying to answer that, but it's a process we're trying to also slow.
But we're making progress on it.
Lots
So
of progress.
so okay. So you gave me your definition
Yeah.
on what aging is. Now, earlier you said biological age.
Yeah.
So for the people, we have a lot of doctors that tune into the podcast.
Mhm.
And for the new ones who don't understand the difference between biological age and chronological age, what's the difference between both?
Well, so we track chronological age as a relatively arbitrary number, right? It's sort of the number of trips we've done around the sun.
Right.
But we all know people in their 70s who look like they're 50, right? And we all know people the other way around. Maybe people in their who have smoked and they might be in their 50s that look like they're 70. And this is not abnormal for doctors either. Like even things like transplant decisions or whether or not you'll get a orthopedic, hip transplant or hip
Right.
replacement would be one of those things. But the problem is that with aging being the biggest risk factor, we know that there's a molecular signature of this process too. And so that's really the difference is we want to measure your body's aging, not just the definition of how many times you've been around the sun.
Right. Right. So okay. So we know the difference between biological age versus chronological age, which now we're getting into more of the science of it.
Yeah.
And now the last thing that where I kind of interrupted was talking about epigenetics.
Yeah. Mhm.
So we see so many people offering genetic testing and this type of genetic testing and this
Yeah.
specialized epigenetic testing. Let's talk about that because right now, I mean, there's tons of companies out there, massive companies.
Yeah.
You got companies that are on huge platforms that were never even in medicine
Yeah.
that are offering all of these tests. So, when you look at all of these different type of epigenetic tests, these genetic tests, and
Yeah.
all the stuff that's out there, like, everybody can't have the best test. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying? So I wanna talk about I wanna understand what epigenetics are and
yeah.
what is a good quality test.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with genetics if that's
Okay.
okay, just as a baseline, because I think that most people know that when we sequence your genome, we're looking at four base pairs: A, C, T's, and G's, and we're sort of saying, what do you have? And we're interpreting that data based off of big population level data sets, right? So we might find certain variants lead to Alzheimer's, or certain variants lead to methylation problems. And so that industry has been around for a long time, and unfortunately, though, there's not been a lot of growth in that industry.
Mm.
For instance, look at your 23andMe. I mean, they were worth several billion a couple years ago. Now they're at risk of being delisted from the stock exchange because they've diminished so much. And what you've seen now is that genetic companies are they're all doing pretty much the same assays, but it's how they're reporting and interpreting the data that really goes to the clients and determines success. So you have people doing, for instance, DNA methylation testing. That's a little bit different than the DNA methylation that we do. So DNA testing for things like MTHFR variants or COMT, that's looking at your biochemical ability to methylate, whereas we're looking at the actual DNA and tags on that DNA, which change whether your genes are turned on and not turned off. So the example I always like to get is, again, every cell in your body has the same DNA, right? Your brain, your skin, your heart. If we took a DNA sample from any of those, we get the exact same data.
Mhm.
Epigenetics, though, is the reason that all those cells behave differently, right? As we go from our
Mm.
pluripotent stem cell to the cell type that we're becoming, it's all about what's turned on and turned off, and that's really what epigenetics is doing. Is it's handling the identity and expression of your cells, and so that's a much more valuable data set because it changes. It can tell us about risk just as well, but even better. But it also is modifiable. So
So
on,
let's
yeah,
highlight expression of the
yeah.
cells because when you don't have the appropriate expression, correct me if I'm wrong, you being the professional here, that's where disease can develop, right?
Exactly. And I like to use the example of there's a type of gene called the tumor suppressor gene, right? These tumor suppressor genes do exactly what they say, right? They make sure tumors don't grow. On the other side, we have oncogenes, genes that promote growth and might turn into cancer. If you get those dysregulated, then it's going to affect your ability to get cancer, right? But epigenetics happens in every gene in our body.
And those are the oncosomes?
Yeah, so
Is
the oncogenes are
oncogenes.
mainly growth factor related
Okay.
genes, and so generally we want them turned off, so we're not leading to those areas. And the way that we turn off genes is DNA methylation. We attach a
Mm.
little group to those genes, and then we stop them from becoming RNA, essentially. So epigenetics just stands for epi means above the genome. These are things that are happening to change. It's sort of like DNA is the hardware, epigenetics is the software.
All right. So the true question here is what causes gene expression change?
Yeah, your body has a extremely complicated mechanisms to regulate this. And I tell people if you have problems with regulating this DNA expression, you just don't survive. It's not like a COMT variant or MTHFR where you have increased homocysteine or have heart issues or psychiatric issues where you can supplement with a single supplement and fix those. This is a process that is so fundamental to our bodies and to our identity that if something goes wrong, it's usually really really bad.
Right.
So with that being said, we have a lot of different epigenetic mechanisms, but the one that is by far the most studied is DNA methylation, sort of that off switch to genes.
Okay. Now, what about like environmental toxins? What kind
Yeah.
of effect does that have on gene expression?
Yeah, massive effects, and this is actually one of the coolest parts of epigenetics. TruDiagnostic is built the largest DNA methylation data set in the world, but we also are really just known for the algorithms to interpret that data.
Mm.
And so biological aging is certainly one of those big categories that we think is important due to how big aging is in terms of health. But we can create algorithms for just about anything from this data. So we
Wow.
can diagnose schizophrenia. Previously, you had to go to a psychologist who could diagnose schizophrenia or psychiatrist.
And how many people were probably getting misdiagnosed though?
Yeah, there's it's a lot,
Yeah.
and even now we're you could diagnose diabetes, but now we even have subtypes of diabetes, 4 different subtypes, each with different risks and each with different treatment recommendations,
Wow.
all through epigenetics. We can tell what zip code you've lived in due to most of the pollution markers in your DNA.
Wow.
We can tell you, again, when you're going to die with a 92% accuracy within a 5-year time period. The things we can do with this
Really?
data are incredible. And one of the biggest areas of investigation is what we call the exposome, all the different things we're exposed to. Actually, there's just a study last week that showed that the exposome is 10 times more predictive of disease outcomes than your genetics.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So hold on one second. You're saying that you could predict 5 years in advance before someone's going to die?
Yeah. So if I took
That
your
kind of
test,
sounds like the Gary Brecka guy, where he's just
yeah.
like, "Oh, I work for an insurance company, and I can tell you to the second that you're gonna croak out."
Well, there's
Yeah.
a difference, and mainly which is that we have validated and published our data, right? We're not
Wow.
making claims. We've published with Harvard our ability to predict it with a 92% accuracy in 5 years, and that's still a big gap, right? We're telling, hey, we're accurate within a 5-year time period, right? No one can get as accurate as even a year or months.
Right.
That just doesn't exist right now in the scientific world. But yeah, that's where we're getting to, is that we can predict it highly accurately, but not just death, also disease. We can predict when diseases are coming. We can, again, tell you so many interesting things just from a drop of blood. I know it sounds a
Wow.
little bit like Theranos, right?
Just a drop of blood.
Yeah, we just need the
Wow.
DNA from the white blood cells that exist in your blood. And so we measure about a little over 1 million locations, and we get numbers between 0 and 1. The closer the number is to 0, that means the more turned on that gene is. The more closer it is to 1, the more turned off that gene is. And so that's a lot of data, right? It's data we could not interpret by ourselves, which is why AI is so important and why this technology is growing so much right now.
So you guys are actively using a lot of AI.
Every day.
Unbelievable. Huh?
Yeah, massive.
Yeah.
I mean, we spend a lot of money with compute and Amazon
Yes.
Web Services because we're compiling as much data as possible, and that's how we create our algorithms. So, for instance, we want to predict death. The first
Right.
thing we have to do is have samples from people who've already passed away, right?
Mm.
So we'll go to big biobanks. Our biggest collaborator is Harvard and Mass General Brigham's, where we collect these samples from 20 or 30 years ago, and then we know what happens to these individuals, and we create algorithms to predict that outcome.
Wow.
And that's why, with aging, we don't have, for instance, we can't treat aging by waiting 40 years to see what happens, right? You and I might try some NAD, we might do it frequently, but in order to know if it's extending our lifespan, we're going to have to wait a while, right?
Right.
And so these surrogates, this testing that we're doing, being able to predict things like time until death, if we see that change, we can be fairly confident that also our time of death is going to change. We don't
Right.
have to wait 40 years for these interventional trials to tell us if something's actually going to work. We can do it at a much quicker pace. And that's really what we started out doing. And then we found all of these other signals which are equally applicable in health.
Right. Like, dude, how many books do you read a day? Where do you
Yeah.
get this information? Because this
Yeah.
is not just information that's like readily available, you know?
Yeah, I have all my time spent with primary research. So for anyone who's out there, my trick now is just Google alerts. Keywords that I always like to read up on. So keywords for every peptide you can imagine, keywords for every type of diagnostic, and then again using AI to sort of consolidate and summarize it all.
We
for
need to
me.
research your DNA, man. That's what I want, you know? So,
Yeah.
all right, all very interesting things. So, all right, so going back to all the epigenetic testing
Mhm.
and whatnot, what are you seeing through the different like ethnic groups that
Yeah.
are out there? Because you know,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of the biohacking industry, when it comes to functional medicine, which by the way, a lot of the stuff you're doing, I consider that precision medicine because
Yeah.
you guys are going very precise. But it's always been available for really like the rich and famous,
Yeah.
right? And one of the things when we're talking about bringing this to the masses, there's different ethnicity groups that need to
Yeah.
be studied as well too. Is that something that you guys are dabbling into?
Yeah, we're trying, but it's also a problem with even us. Even Mass General's biobank, over 85% of the samples are still Caucasian. So it's an issue
Mm,
not just in our world, but I think even in the traditional medicine world
right.
as well. But But with that being said, the epigenetics certainly changes with ethnicities. One of my favorite things to talk about is with some of the early research, there's something called the Latino paradox, which means that they have higher rates of disease but lower biological ages than expected. And so that's certainly interesting. And so we're trying to build those data sets all over the world. And one of the ways we're doing that is by setting up sort of laboratory testing locations in a variety of different countries, so that we can get more representation of a lot of diverse groups and data sets. And so definitely doing a lot now in Southeast Asia, have a lot of European representation. Soon we're going to be doing a lot of South American testing within Brazil. So starting to build those data sets. But the thing with epigenetics is it's still a very new measurement. And so we have the opportunity to correct some of the injustices that were done in the DNA world, where that was the only group that they sort of looked at.
Right.
And so I think that it's what we're seeing is certainly that it has a lot more representation than previously, but still there's some things we need to fix for sure.
What are you guys doing in the Black and brown communities?
Yeah. So generally, so we've been working with cohorts like the All of Us cohort, which are based for ethnic representation. And so we're specifically funding trials to get data from those groups, particularly those groups with outcome data as well.
Okay.
And I hate to say, well, a lot of it is also epidemiologic to look at things like exposures, right? Even just if we were to plot biological age acceleration by socioeconomics or neighborhood behaviors, we can see things like micronutrient deficiencies, or these other things, even pollution exposure a little bit higher. So I think that that's the other great thing about these tools is that they can sort of highlight how all these socioeconomic disadvantages in different groups, even myself being from Eastern Kentucky, right? Not the most advantaged group, but we see epigenetic age acceleration in those individuals as
Right.
well. So this is a good way to sort of take a really broad diagnostic and be able to talk about those things with real data.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So, when you're looking at the different groups, are you guys involved with like the blue zones at all?
So we are only involved with one, which is Loma Linda, and have some data there. But yeah, it's a big area of research in our field.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's one of the big things. Like, everyone's living past 100.
Yeah.
Like, and people really want to study that.
Yeah, exactly. And we have cohorts that are made of only people above 100 years of age, these sort of
Right.
centenarian cohorts to try and find out what's changing. And the good news is we find a lot of what we expect, which is, lower inflammation, lower levels of senescence, all of these other things that we look at. But also, as I mentioned, these exposome factors, the things we're exposed to, including diet, nutrition, chemicals, et cetera, those play a massive impact. And so geographical locations like that are also super helpful to see what they actually are.
So when you do the epigenetic testing,
Mhm.
one of the things that you guys are also looking at when you're doing this testing with that one little
Mhm.
drop is micronutrients deficiencies, right?
Yeah.
And then other things besides micronutrients deficiencies,
Yeah.
you guys are doing what other type of testing are you doing through that?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I might even just provide a little bit of history and background onto how we stumbled upon this because
Yeah,
it wasn't
absolutely.
expected at all. But one of the things we saw is there have been now several biological clocks created, starting in 2013 with Steve Horvath at UCLA. That really started it, and since then there's been a lot of iterations. But every single iteration we found that one thing was true: the more data you train with, the better your algorithms are.
Right.
And so we decided to create the most robust data set we could. We measured everything we could possibly measure in a single individual, from full genome to epigenetics to transcriptomics to proteins, over 8,000 proteins, over 3,000 metabolites like your hormones, dopamine, serotonin. And we did that in about 5,000 individuals. So if we did that in every single individual, it would have cost $10,000 to $15,000, which is just not a viable option, right? We're getting into where it's only available for the rich and famous, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so we asked the question: Can we just by chance predict these other measurements just through DNA methylation? And we were really, really surprised that the answer was absolutely. So we created predictors of 1,700 different factors, and so that includes everything from your HDL and LDL particle lipids to your hormone levels to environmental chemicals like PFAS chemicals or lead exposure or glyphosate pesticide exposure, your
Ah,
NAD biomarkers, and we can do them really, really accurately. We found in the study we published with Harvard just in December of last year, we showed that we were 90% accurate within the clinical range, but most of the time, we were more predictive of outcomes than the classical disease biomarker. So, for instance, our prediction of blood pressure was better than measured blood pressure in this cohort, predicting cardiovascular disease, just to give you one example. But most of the ones that we created are actually more predictive of outcomes. And the reason for that is because our measurements are a little bit more like HbA1c, sort of a running average over time versus a fasting glucose, right?
Right.
So a fasting glucose, you could just have a sugary, drink right before you test. It goes up, and you could say, hey, that person has diabetes if you didn't know they already took a drink, right?
Right.
Whereas HbA1c is sort of a running average. It tells you about that overall behavior. And
Right.
that's the same with the DNA methylation, is we're getting overall signals, which are incredibly predictive, but the amount of information we get now is pretty incredible.
That's amazing, man. So, obviously, I'm very knees deep in
Yeah,
the IV vitamin therapy space.
absolutely. Yeah.
How can an epigenetic test really help these medical providers that are offering IV nutrients? Is it able to kind of like give us the information of, hey, this is the type of IV drip the patient needs?
Yeah, absolutely. We can tell you what their levels are of all of their amino acids. We can do all of their vitamins, like the B vitamins, the ADEKs. We can do your omega threes. We can
Glutathione too?
glutathione, absolutely. We
Wow.
can do glutathione sulfate. We can do the metabolites of glutathione. We can do acetylcarnitine. We can do just about everything that you would put in an IV drip, whether it's a
Wow.
Myers cocktail or something a little bit more personalized, right? And so all of that we can tell, and again, we can get that running average. So the idea is that for that running average, you probably want to do more than one IV, right? You
Right, right.
probably want to do a therapy to get those levels back to where we want. And we can also then tell you how those levels are associated with outcomes, because we have outcomes on all of those patients as well. So we can
Wow.
say, one of my favorite examples is, ergothioneine. It's a supplement that's found in mushrooms, but it helps with mitochondrial function, and we have identified it as being one of the most important things for longevity in all of the measurements we take. And so now we can quantify ergothioneine, tell you where you're at, and along with all of those other, we have now a report that does over 135 different biomarkers, including NAD. So I'll throw another anecdote out there, just because I know a lot of people are interested in NAD. We did an analysis in our cohort about 15,000 people who had taken nicotinamide riboside, one of the precursors to NAD that's available as a supplement, versus also the nicotide mononucleotide, which is sort of the competitor supplement. And we found that with NMN, we hardly saw any intracellular increase, but within all of the NAD pathway molecules were increased. And so just in a big meta-analysis, we were able to say, hey, for longevity, we might recommend nicotinamide riboside over NMN.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was published in that same
Would it
paper.
make sense to take both of the products?
Yeah, I think that if you want to maybe hedge your bets a little bit, I think so. One of the things with even NAD is it can go too high, right? And some of the downstream metabolites of NAD, like 2-PY and 4-PY, have been shown to be toxic to the heart and kidneys. So generally, we don't want to over supplement either,
Right.
which is exactly why testing is important.
Look, I take both. I take NMN
Yeah.
and also NR.
Hmm.
Actually, I take all three. I take
Yeah.
NAD also.
Yeah.
So hopefully I'm not overdoing it. I feel fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm energetic.
I'll give you a
So
test. We'll test
yeah.
your 2-PY. Yeah.
No, for real. Yeah, let's definitely run that test. Okay, so cool. So we got the testing
Yeah.
that can really be precise to what the patient needs, especially if it comes to IV therapy. Now, part of that testing also, there's some of the toxic stuff
Yeah.
that come up, and you were mentioning to me that you guys are working with first responders, right? Which
Yeah.
obviously, with my background, this is something that we got to talk about because, dude, since I retired from the fire department, a lot of the guys and girls that I worked
Yeah.
with, man, some of them are getting diagnosed. A lot of them are getting diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
There's deaths all the time. I'm in a Facebook group and I
Mhm.
see it all the
Yeah.
time. It's just like, what the heck is going on out there? Because
Yeah.
these firefighters, they get exposed to all kinds of crap, and then
Exactly.
plus sleep deprivation, the
Mhm.
stress levels, their cortisol's completely off.
Yeah.
So, what have you guys seen with like first responders with what you're doing?
Yeah, so we're still building these data sets. We're working and collaborating with the University of Michigan on some of these. But certainly, number one thing we see increased biological age, right? Just as an overall category. And that could be to all the things you mentioned. It could be a high stress job, right? The stress could be causing issue. It could be the shift behavior work, right? Which we
Right.
see, again, even ER physicians for us are a group with accelerated aging that might be for some of the same reasons. But the big thing we're looking at is much like in recent years, the military and burn pits have gotten a lot of a lot of press about sort of predisposing a lot of the military service people to things like cancer, as you mentioned, and it's actually the same with firefighters. Whenever everything is going up in flames, everything that they're inhaling, all the things they're exposed
Yeah, all
to.
the carcinogens and all that
Yeah.
crap,
And
right?
so we're starting to then see that molecularly, right? To show how they're increasing their aging, but also to actually quantify those exposures. And so we're seeing a lot of sort of toxic chemical buildup, even in just the epigenetics, that certainly need to be addressed, right? It needs to, and it starts to address it. You really need good data, and that's what we're trying to build. And but it's definitive, negative outcomes, unfortunately, based on the risk that they're putting themselves at.
Of course. So when you actually get those results,
Yeah.
right,
Mhm.
and you see that there's a lot of these forever chemicals and everything else,
Yeah.
what's the typical course of treatment at that point?
It's a tough one, right? Where right now the all the rage is the plasma exchange and plasmapheresis, and so this is certainly something. We did a trial with the Buck Institute and on therapeutic plasma exchange, and we saw anti-aging reductions with it with several courses of therapy. But it also removes things like microplastics. It removes those PFAS chemicals, and so it's a good way to sort of clean that plasma.
Right.
But it's also expensive, and it needs to be done fairly frequently. And in aging, it's also a big investigation because some people like to do young plasma from younger individuals. Bryan Johnson made a lot of news for taking his son's blood and giving his blood to his father. But we see that young plasma definitely has an anti-aging effect, but the therapeutic way to reduce those chemicals is therapeutic plasma exchange, at least for now, probably one of the most exciting therapies.
Interesting. What do you think about that Bryan Johnson guy?
I've known Brian now for a while. We do some things with him. We created the Rejuvenation Olympics, sort of a competitive leaderboard for the best agers, and he's doing phenomenal on that. I think that he is certainly avant-garde, so he speaks to my heart, right? I tend to be very close there too, but I also think that what he's doing for the aging industry is really important. Sort of shifting the conceptions on that, talking about it as a true science and as a protocol to follow. And so I know he definitely has his opponents as well as his supporters. But in a recent study, I think over 65% of the physicians in aging tend to support him and the energy he's bringing to the space. Even most recently, he was on with the Kardashians doing our testing with Dr. Huberman as well, and so he's brought a much needed new audience to this as
That's
well.
amazing.
Yeah.
So you guys were part of that with the Kardashians.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were just on a few weeks ago with Brian doing our testing with the group, but the Kardashians themselves on the season finale last year did our testing and quite frankly did really really well.
Amazing.
Yeah, they were phenomenal. Chloe in particular had one of the best aging rates, which would qualify her to be on the top 10 of that Rejuvenation Olympics
Really?
leaderboard.
Yeah. It's amazing to utilize people at that caliber to really get the message out there because this is how we're really going to hit the masses, right? Is utilizing some of these celebrity individuals to
absolutely.
go through the process themselves and showcase like what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the funniest things to see on the back end of this is that celebrities do pretty well on our testing, right? And it's interesting to see. We all look at them and say, hey, they're getting a ton of work done, they're doing all these things, but they're actually also doing the things to take care of their body because they have the
Right.
time, they have the resources, and so we can see it molecularly. So it's interesting that they're bringing attention to the space, but they're also sort of establishing what are the best protocols and really giving us good data as well.
I've actually noticed a lot of these celebrities,
Yeah.
their homes now, they're actually like reconstructing them and making them into like these biohacking homes
Yeah.
where they have the infrared saunas, the cryotherapy, the vitamin rain showers, all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff.
The hyperbaric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I
Yeah.
saw Paris Hilton the other day,
Yeah.
like her whole thing. I think it got messed up with the whole fires in
Yeah.
California,
Yeah.
but she had everything. And
Mhm.
hers was like customized. It kind of looked like a Barbie's house, with the pink and stuff.
Yeah.
So, but it's cool that they're doing it,
Yeah.
and you're even seeing a lot of people in the hip hop world
Oh,
that
yeah.
are dabbling into more of the health and wellness.
Yeah.
Noriega is one of them. He
Mhm.
actually comes over to Liquivita. He posted
Yeah.
about it the other day. And these are things that, wasn't really part of the culture. And
Exactly.
now people are just like, they're doing it because
Yeah.
they feel a lot better. The mental focus, clarity, they're able to perform better when they're out running or,
Exactly.
playing with their kids. So it's
Yeah.
amazing to actually see that.
Yeah, it's longevity's having its moment right now, and really health and longevity are having their moments, but especially longevity. I mean, you have even people like the Saudi Arabian government doing 1 billion in longevity research every single year. It's the longevity specific movement is no longer, science fiction, right?
Right.
It is real, and some of the developments that are happening, blow my mind every single day. I think that, whenever I even first started TruDiagnostics as a company, I thought, hey, there's no way we're gonna, you know, have longevity escape velocity and start to live longer than 120. Like I was extremely skeptical, and now I see that there's pathways to that, that are based in fact and reality, and the science is just exploding. So I hope that, as a scientist, it gets me excited, but I hope that it gets everyone else excited too, because we're
Absolutely.
about to have massive improvements to our quality of life, and extending that quality of life for a good amount of time.
Amazing. Amazing. Right. Do you publish any? Have you published any books?
No books, a lot of scientific articles. We've done, I think, over 45 scientific articles in the past 3 years that we published. So that's why I usually point to my work. But eventually, a book might be in there just to talk about all the things we've seen throughout the space.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I listen. I'd buy it and read it if you had it. So one of the things with a lot of the new treatment modalities and the testing and everything else that you see in the industry, sometimes when we talk about the functional medicine space, it becomes difficult for us to allow it to go mainstream.
Mhm.
And that's just because we hit a lot of roadblocks with a lot of these regulatory bodies.
Yeah.
What have you experienced with a lot of these
Yeah.
regulatory bodies, really trying to get this more into like that allopathic traditional medicine
Yeah.
world where we could really hit the masses?
Yeah, I think I've got a lot of thoughts on regulatory, but for us, it's always started with aging specifically, and unfortunately, the U.S. does not accept aging as a disease. The World Health Organization has an ICD extension code, which can classify a disease as a result of aging, which is really good
Mm,
progress. But the United States doesn't really have a pathway. If we're going to talk about aging, the closest we can get are things like frailty and the loss of muscle mass as we age, and so I really hope that that we see movement there, and I think there's some government agencies like ARPA that are funding massive projects to get FDA approved aging diagnostics, which is great. But I think that the connection between some of these more or is it less allopathic, less traditional medicine. Has to come through data. I don't think we can talk about patient success stories every single day, but in the back of most of the regulatory minds, I think it's, well, they might be the exception to the rule, right? And I think once we start demonstrating the data, the reliability, she's talking about things like significant outcomes,
right.
all of these different things, I think it's necessary. And hopefully, diagnostic testing is a way to do that, to compile it at scale. You think of, again, these physicians, they're all doing, 500, 1,000 patients, and really that data goes nowhere. They see that data, and that's the end of it. What we're trying to do is to make sort of a community where we share outcome data, and really, use our testing to show that we're changing outcomes, and we don't have to wait 30 years to do it.
Yeah, man, you hit the nail on the head on that one. It's like at the end of the day, you can have all the case studies that you want
Mhm.
showing, oh, this patient feels better. But once you have that quantifiable data, I
Exactly.
mean, now people have to listen,
Exactly. It's
right?
inscrutable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, right now we're going through this huge movement with the new administration.
Yeah.
Make America Healthy Again, the
Yeah.
MAHA movement.
Mhm.
But we have RFK Jr.,
Yeah.
leading the health human
Yeah.
services for the United States.
Yeah.
What's your input on that? What's your
Yeah.
thought about it?
Oh, I have mixed feelings. We've talked about peptides, right? It was crazy to see on election night RFK tweet out that peptides are going to be something he's focused on to make available again, especially with all the trauma that we went through on the peptides, right? I was super excited to see that,
Yeah.
and some of the talks about the environmental exposures and just the movement back to more natural
He's like
foods.
speaking our language,
Yeah,
And
exactly.
truthfully, I didn't see
Yeah,
it coming this early.
yeah.
Like this is part of the change of course of medicine, if
Yeah.
it really does happen.
Completely agree. But I will also mention on the other side, we do so much with universities. We do, we've probably had 47 different university partnerships in the last few years. And unfortunately, that space is a little bit more worrisome. Things like cutting the indirect rates to 15%. There are now whole universities which are not accepting any more PhDs. They're not doing any investment into research and funding. And so I see both sides of it, where I think, I love the exploration of of these other topics. But at the same time, the U.S. has been built on an amazing foundation of scientific research and development, and I don't want to lose our competitive advantage there by trying to cut pennies on lab costs and other things of that nature. So I really hope that they continue to fund scientific development as a through the NIH. But I'm also so happy to hear that they're paying attention to the things we're already talking about.
Yeah, I think it's more or less being able to support the correct
Yeah.
type of research,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Being able to fund that type of research,
Yeah.
which like stuff that you're doing,
Yeah.
I think it's a
Exactly.
big part. Are you connected with the RFK and them whatsoever at all?
Not traditionally. We haven't done a ton of government funding, but with that being said, we're doing a lot more now, and so starting moving more in that direction. But yeah, and to even go back, we can't even put the word diversity in grants anymore. They're automatically killed. So yeah,
Yeah,
as we're talking about representation of brown and black communities, it's one of those things that's now even harder to fund.
right, right.
So there's good things and bad things, but I think that ultimately, the science community is hitting its moment, and I think that's really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what's the next big thing for Ryan Smith over here?
The biggest thing for us is FDA approval right now. So we've gotten, we've built a huge database. We've created some great algorithms, some great publications, things I never would have thought. But we really want our type of testing to be done twice a year and financed by Medicaid and Medicare. We think that it can replace a lot of traditional diagnostics with a lot more information at a much lower cost and something that people can make accessible at home. Right, you see groups like Function Health,
Right.
that are now making at-home testing available and receiving lots of market
That's
response.
Dr. Mark Hyman's company,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly. And so we want to do something similar. We want to make testing widely available, but to not just do 130 biomarkers, but to do disease-specific risk scores, Alzheimer's risk scores, all the micronutrient testing, and all in one single consolidated diagnostic. And so we're going to continue to publish, continue to validate. And on the other side of things, we really want to figure out what works for aging. And so we just recently published a trial with Yale where we compared 51 different aging interventions before and after, everything from rapamycin to exercise to hyperbaric to stem cells, all in one publication. So we're hoping we can really treat aging like the science it is and give people really precise recommendations on how to reverse it.
Amazing, man. I love that. Ryan, if there's one physician
Yeah.
or medical provider out there that's listening, or even a consumer that
Yeah.
resonates with everything you talked about today, what is one thing you can leave them with?
Ooh, I would say, you can't uh, quantify, or you can't treat what you can't measure, right? So my number one thing would be do diagnostics, even if it's not ours. Do your blood testing, right? Do all of these different things. Get a good baseline and treat it like a project, right? Treat it, get the data, find out what works to improve that data, and then retest, right? And I think that that would be my number one recommendation to get it more into a science. Obviously, feel good, but also keep track of those biomarkers.
I love it. And Ryan, I'm in the process of writing a new book.
Yeah.
It's called Your Wellness Data,
Mhm.
and I want you to have a chapter in that book
I'd love
and
to.
talking about
Yeah.
epigenetics and everything that you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's so important to be empowered with your own data. One of my favorite anecdotes is that even before we could start in Kentucky, you weren't allowed to order your own labs in the state of Kentucky. You weren't allowed to
Wow.
order your own testing, and it really limits the amount of empowerment you could have into your own health. And so we got that law changed, thank goodness. But I'm a huge proponent of getting your data, knowing what it means, and
Absolutely.
empowering yourself in that direction.
I agree. Ryan, where can people find you, man?
Yeah, yeah. So I tend to have my head buried in science and research rather than being a huge public figure. But TruDiagnostic is one of our best places. Have also a Twitter handle. It's just Ryan Smith EpiAge as well, where I'll post some good science. And then obviously you can find me on LinkedIn too, where I have a more presence on all the scientific work we do.
Amazing. Ryan, it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast,
Yeah.
man. And let's get this information out to the whole world.
Yeah, appreciate you for having me. Thanks so much.
Awesome, brother.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching another episode of a Healthy Point of View podcast. Make sure you follow Ryan Smith. Make sure you follow TruDiagnostics. Make sure you click, share, do all that fun stuff. Make sure you subscribe as well too. And we'll see you for the next one.